This Affable Life interviews all kinds of wonderful people, and they're always affable. I insist on talking to affable people, and the Reverend Paul Arnott is just one of those. Affable people who have done great things with their lives, made a difference in other people's lives as well as their own, and whose focus is on making life better for others. Paul, how are you today?
Look, I'm going well. We're lying low and going for a daily walk of about 6 or 7K, staying fit in the midst of the lockdown or the semi-lockdown or whatever kind of lockdown it is we're in the midst of at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's fine. But I'm very aware that there are lots of people out there who are really doing it tough, and my heart goes out to them.
Yeah, there are lots of people doing it tough.
It's going to get far worse before it gets better.
Yeah. Paul, I want to talk to you. You're an Anglican minister. You've had quite an interesting career there, and I'd like you to give us a quick summary of that. And then we're going to talk about the work that you did with the ABC, because the focus of this interview is the ABC, the need we have for the ABC, particularly in this time of COVID, where, you know, people are either in lockdown, people are depressed, people are finding life really difficult. And the ABC, I believe, is part of the mental health of Australia. Our response should be to support the ABC. So, Paul, give us a quick thumbnail sketch of your career as an Anglican priest.
As an Anglican priest or working for the ABC?
Well, give me your Anglican priest stuff first.
Okay, I was ordained in 1986 in Tasmania. And spent 15 years, almost 16 years in parish ministry in 5 different parishes all over Tassie. And it was an incredible experience in many, many ways. And I look back on it with a great sense of gratitude. Mostly country parishes, because Tasmania is just one big country town. Although people in Hobart and Launceston wouldn't like to think that, but it's a beautiful place, always has been, always will be. But it was doing it tough then, and I think it's doing it a lot tougher now.
You worked for the ABC, you were a broadcaster for 12 years, is that right?
Correct. Began working for the ABC in June 1971, last century.
Wow.
And my first position for 2 months was the Tasmanian correspondent for AM and PM. Which was a bit of a joke because I'd worked in tourism for 3.5 years. I really had no idea what I was doing. The ABC back in those days, and it's probably not dissimilar now, was a wonderful opportunity to learn a skill, to learn a trade. And I got thrown in off the deep end. And yeah, it took me a few years to learn how to interview. It took me a few years to learn how to really listen to those I was interviewing. And then I moved to Launceston when they began a breakfast program there about 12 months later, and did current affairs input into breakfast, then into a morning show, then ended up with an afternoon current affairs program at 5:15 at night, which picked up the issues of the day. So it was a great opportunity, and working mostly in regional radio. And I loved it. My wife used to joke, she said, "You don't really work, do you?"
Well, I've got to say to you that I knew you long before we met, because I've been an avid supporter of the ABC for many years. I go to bed with the ABC and I wake up with the ABC. AM and PM were always part of my agenda of the day. And so, you know, I knew of you long before you knew of me.
Well,
now,
you're not alone in being an ABC viewer and listener.
Well, Paul, you know, when you look at the numbers of people who support the ABC, it's estimated 80% of Australians are supporters of the ABC in one way or another. And when you also look at the leading journalists around Australia in all media, many of the best of them, shall I say, learnt their skills at the ABC, and you probably would be aware of that.
True. And some of the best of them are still with the ABC. My favourite program of the week is Media Watch with Paul Barry, and just incredible stuff, cutting edge stuff, really holding people accountable, both globally and nationally.
I'm glad you raised Media Watch because it's also one of my favourite programs. And one of the things that I find really interesting about Media Watch is that it holds the ABC to account.
Yes, I sometimes wonder how David Anderson feels about that. but that's great. I mean, you know, no holds barred. If the ABC is stuffed up and done the wrong thing, it gets held accountable, and that's as it should be.
And when it's held accountable, he doesn't hold back. And the, you know, Media Watch has done that consistently, not just with Paul Barry. So, you know, if you were working for the ABC and you made some big mistake, you know, you'd cop it pretty fair and sweet. Maybe not sweet, but you don't see that, and you can't see that in the commercial media.
No, and that's the big worry at the moment, I think, with these cutbacks. The ABC is really the only truly independent media in Australia. I know that The Age and Sydney Morning Herald do some great work, but they're now under the control of Channel 9, and who knows where that will lead in the longer term.
No, yeah, I agree with that. Now, Paul, what do you say to the accusations that people, the opposers to the ABC will say that the ABC is biased? It's, you know, left-centred.
Well, let me tell you a story. When I worked for the ABC, every year there would be criticisms the ABC was biased. And so we used to tally up the criticisms. In those days, it was, would you believe it, letters? People,
Yes.
you remember when people wrote letters?
I can vaguely remember.
And we would tally up the letters accusing the ABC of bias towards Labor and accusing the ABC of bias towards the coalition. And they were always 50-50.
Yes.
Now, people wouldn't believe that. People probably still don't believe it, but it's true. You know, bias is in the eye of the beholder.
Exactly.
It's a thing that psychologists call projection. And that was true of those days, and I'm sure it's equally true of these days.
I'd like to read to you a little bit, and to the viewer that we have for this podcast, a letter that was addressed from the Friends of the ABC. And I'm not going to read it all. I'm just going to read a couple of segments from Margaret Reynolds, National President of the ABC Friends. She writes to the Prime Minister, right on behalf of many angry Australians who want to know why your government continues to undermine Australian public broadcasting with ongoing public funding cutbacks at the same time as the commercial media sector is favoured. She writes, your recent statement that there have been no cuts to the ABC sadly reminds us of Tony Abbott's similar bold election promise in 2013. Just to recount, he said there'd be no cuts. Yet this was followed by major cutbacks in his first budget as Prime Minister. Clearly, in our current media environment, there are facts and alternative facts. It all depends on the presenter and the audience. Many of us are more inclined to rely on information from your ABC board chair, Ita Buttrose, who said in her 2019 foreword to the annual report, our task has been made harder by the imposition of the 3-year indexation freeze, which comes on top of a $50 million a year cut, now embedded in our base. And she writes, we see the recently announced 5-year plan as a brave attempt by the Managing Director, David Anderson, to live within your government's funding allocation, but obviously further staff cuts and downgrading of ABC services and programs is an inevitable outcome of reduced funding. And I'm just going to skip down a little bit further. Chair of the ABC board, Ita Buttrose, has consistently tried to work with you and your communications minister, Paul Fletcher, to get a realistic reassessment of the ABC budget to meet the demands of a changing media environment and national emergencies. Yet these genuine efforts by both board and management have been repeatedly ignored. Furthermore, there's been a quite calculated misrepresentation of budgetary analysis since 2014, assuming that official promotion of fake news will provide an effective distraction from the reality of past and current government decision-making, which has resulted in an ongoing 10% budget reduction. Now, I'm going to put that letter in the down there in the podcast for people to read. There's a fair bit in what I've read, even though I've only read probably half of the letter. Any comments from you there, Paul?
Look, where do you start? An ongoing 10% cut is just huge in terms of programs and staff. Heaven knows how the ABC is going to, well, it can't. I mean, you know, it's already scrapped the 7:45 AM bulletin.
Yep.
There are going to have to be major cutbacks in terms of Australian drama, current affairs. Look, the ABC is the only independent media in Australia, the only organisation that is really, truly going to hold governments of both colours to account. I just think it's extraordinary. And to be blunt, the coalition has always believed that the ABC is biased towards Labor, and I see this as continuing payback for that belief. It's a false belief, but, you know, perception is reality. And if they continue to believe the ABC is biased against them, they'll continue to punish the ABC and try and cut it back. But, you know, will the day come, David, when the ABC, in the middle of bushfires and heaven knows what this next summer's going to be like, says we haven't got the money to continue to broadcast warnings and emergency warnings in the midst of bushfires? Are we going to get to that stage? And is that something that the government would like to see? I doubt it very much.
Well, unofficially, I am aware that journalists and photographers and video folk, some of them actually probably volunteered, shall we say, in different ways during the fires, because there just wasn't the money to cover this crisis, huge crisis in the country.
But that's part of the ABC charter, to cover.
Yep, that's right. I wonder whether there's a way that the government can actually be prosecuted on this, because the government, the ABC, the shareholders, we're the shareholders, and the government holds that shareholding for us. We own it. And if they don't fund it properly to do the job that's part of its charter, what redress do we have?
Well, I think the redress we have is to hold the government accountable, and we shouldn't forget the impact that we can have as individuals on this government. Yeah. By writing to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's got an email contact, and people should do that. And they should write to Paul Fletcher. They should write to the Minister for Communications and let them know how they really feel. Can I make two other comments? Firstly,
please do.
We shouldn't underestimate the effect that Rupert Murdoch's organisation is having on the ABC. Consistent criticism of the ABC from the Australian and the Herald, again and again and again and again and again, ad nauseum, not just infinitum.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, Murdoch did all he could to try and stop ABC 24 because he saw it as a direct competition with Sky News. So that's a commercial instinct, isn't it? That's a commercial motivation. The other thing I want to say is, do I, as somebody who worked for the ABC and still watches and listens to the ABC all the time, agree with everything that the ABC says and does? Do I like all of their programs? No, I don't. Some of their programs I just don't watch because I don't like them. That's not the point. The ABC is there to provide a depth and a diversity and a width of programming that will connect with as many people as possible in Australia. So I think sometimes when people say, "Oh, I don't like what's on the ABC. I'm against the ABC." It's really an unfair criticism, given the fact that the ABC has to attempt to cater for 25 million people.
Yeah, no, I agree with that comment. And when you, there's lots of on the ABC that I don't actually agree with. And you know, with the many hours of broadcasting, I can't possibly watch it all or listen to it all. However, I have a theory, and I note that the ABC has picked up on it in some of its advertising now for the ABC Me, which I think is the children's, primarily children's programming. And it talks about mental health. And I believe that the ABC is a contributor, a major contributor to the mental health of Australia, not just in regional areas where people may be isolated from others, you know, farm stations, small towns, whatever, but in the cities. There are so many programs that focus on issues that relate to our mental health. And when you have so many job losses, and particularly in the creative arts area, which has not been funded properly, and there's been lots of people missing out in the stimulus through that, the ABC is still there. We should at least be propping it up properly so that it can reach out and positively affect Australians.
Couldn't agree more, David. When I worked for the ABC in the 70s and 80s, morale was low and output was high, creativity was high. I can't imagine how much further the morale has degenerated in those decades with all the cutbacks and the attacks that have taken place. The fact that the ABC is able to contribute the quality of programming, both radio and television and news and digital, extraordinary digital stuff that it does. No other commercial media does that. No. They don't think it's worth the money in terms of profit and advertising.
No.
I'm amazed that the ABC is the quality that it is, given the weight that it carries.
When we talk about cuts, I just wish that our leaders would be a little bit more sincere in what they say and what they do.
I suspect our leaders are living in an ivory tower, and they don't realise how little trusted they are by ordinary Australians. If they've got out on the street and did some vox pops with people, how much do you trust the federal government? I think they would get a real shock.
Well, let's keep the fight going. Paul, thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to talking to you again.
My pleasure, David. Great to be with you.
Thank you.